Dr. Pinter Brown is now at UC Irvine in Orange County, and she's going to kick us off with an overview, including diagnosis and staging. So, and again, for those of you who've been around for a while and maybe have attended a couple of these programs, I know I get to hear everybody at all of our programs, and every time I learn something new, every time. So I just encourage you to have an open mind and listen for what you didn't know before, because I'm sure something will hit you that you didn't know. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Pinter Brown, and we'll get started.
I'm glad Susan said that, because I bet some of you have heard me give this talk a lot of times. Because it doesn't change a lot, but we always have to start a meeting like this because there's a lot of people here that are new. And if we don't start by explaining the vocabulary and kind of giving the basics, then the entire weekend will be lost for them. And we certainly don't want that. So everybody, this allows us to have the same playing field. So, all right, so I'm going to start really basic. So a lymphoma is a cancer of a cell called a lymphocyte, and lymphocytes are part of our immune system. They're part of our white blood cells. And they basically come in two big varieties, B like in boy and T like in Tom. Most lymphomas in the US are B like in boy. So when you go to something like the Lymphoma Research Foundation, you'll hear a lot about B-cell lymphomas, and that may not relate to a lot of what you're interested in. T-cell lymphomas represent about 15% of the lymphomas in the US. A great number of them involve the skin, because what T cells do, for real, is they're like our foot patrol. So they're mobile cells, they're in our blood, and they go around and they surveil different areas of our body. And when they find something that they believe that the immune system should attack, they go back into the lymph nodes, which is where B cells live, and they have a way of signaling to them so that the immune system then has kind of a concerted way of acting against something. So there is actually a specific group of T lymphocytes that is responsible for the skin. That's their job, patrolling the skin. And they don't stay there, they move. So they have something on them, picture like Velcro. They kind of get into the skin, they slowly move through the skin, and then they eventually make their way back into the blood again, back into the lymph nodes. You'll see a picture of this in just a little bit as we talk about how you stage. So in our blood cells, we have a stem cell, which is the mother of all the cells, and it can commit to being a lymphoid stem cell, and then finally it matures, just like people, and it decides whether it's going to be a T cell or a B cell. And so all the non-Hodgkin's lymphomas are of mature lymphocytes. Some of them are T cell lymphomas, and some of them are B cell lymphomas. But skin lymphomas are, as I said, are really different from the ones that you see in lymph nodes for many reasons. For one thing, the ratio of like T to B cell lymphomas is flipped in skin lymphomas. So skin lymphomas are mostly T cell lymphomas. I just finished telling you that in the US, most lymphomas are B cell lymphomas, and they're in lymph nodes where B cells live. So that's something that's very different about skin lymphomas. Another thing that's really different is that you can have cells in a skin lymphoma that resemble very much perhaps some other lymphoma that's found in lymph nodes, but the behavior will be very, very different. And so the skin lymphomas or cutaneous lymphomas have their own classification of lymphomas and their own staging system to help people decide on treatments. So even though sometimes the cells may very much resemble something that's seen in a lymph node, it turns out that they don't act the same because they're in a different environment, just like many of us might act differently in different environments. The other thing that's very different is that the pathologists don't really rule in my world. They're part of a team. So when I do a skin biopsy, a pathologist might say to me, it looks a lot like mycosis fungoides, but you tell me, you're looking at the person. Does it look like that when you see them? So it's something called a clinical pathologic diagnosis. It means that unlike something, let's say breast cancer, where a pathologist looks at it and says, this clearly looks like breast cancer, it's breast tissue, and there's not a discussion, they hand off a report. When we're dealing with skin lymphomas, and sometimes lymphomas in general, there has to be a discussion between the pathologist and the clinician, the person seeing the patient. because what's under the microscope doesn't tell you the whole story. So as an example, we're going to talk very briefly about a group of disorders called CD30 positive lymphoproliferative disorders. There are a couple of conditions in that group. One's called lymphomatoid papulosis. One's called anaplastic large cell lymphoma. They look very different on the person, and yet under a microscope they can look identical. So it's a good example of how me and my pathologist have to interact to arrive at a final diagnosis for a person. And because of that, people that have skin lymphomas often have a team of people that are helping them. There may be a dermatologist that may or may not be specialized in skin lymphomas, but is helping with the skin. There may be an oncologist who may or may not be a specialist in skin lymphomas, but is helping with treatment. And there's the pathologist, sometimes there's a radiation therapist. There might be all kinds of different people in the team. So a lesson about skin, so that you have some understanding of what it's like when somebody reads a biopsy. So this is a cartoon, and let's see if the pointer, okay. So the skin basically has 3 layers. It has the epidermis, which is the very top layer. Then there's a layer of the dermis, this stuff, and that's where your hair lives. It's where sweat glands live. And then finally we have subcutaneous tissue, which is basically fat. All right, so mycosis fungoides as an example, because it's kind of unique, that when the cells involve the skin, they're right up here, and then they traipse up into the epidermis, and they do it for a reason, because there's a cell in the epidermis that's feeding them. So you'll see in a little bit a picture of what mycosis fungoides looks like on biopsy, and you'll see what I'm talking about. The other skin lymphomas tend to be down in here. And there's even one called subcutaneous paniculitic T-cell lymphoma that's down in here, that's in the fat. So when the pathologist is looking at the biopsy, they're not only looking at what the cell looks like, but where it's placed in the skin in the biopsy. And if it has, say, if it's grouped around a hair cell, or if it's grouped around a sweat gland, that tells people something about what's happening in the skin. So this is the same thing that I showed you in a cartoon, but it's an actual biopsy. So here we have our epidermis. This is normal. And then we have our dermis, and it didn't go down into the fat. So when a pathologist gets one of these specimens, they stain it for something called H&E, that's what you just looked at, that pink kind of look. And then they use a whole host of these things called monoclonal antibodies. So we all have antibodies in our body. They fight infections. So we have a specific antibody that fights strep. We have a specific antibody that fights fungus. What people have done is to create specific antibodies for the purpose of diagnosis and for treatment. So when a pathologist is using monoclonal antibodies, they have hundreds of these things. They're all numbered, and they're preceded by something that says CD. You might have seen it on a path report, cluster designation, and then a number. And when they're trying to evaluate a biopsy, they basically pick these monoclonal antibodies off a shelf, and they pick them with thought. What are they trying to distinguish? What do they think it looks like? And they pick some to help them figure it out. I'll show you what it looks like to a pathologist. There's also monoclonal antibodies that are used for treatment of people. So the best example, probably the first monoclonal antibody, is rituximab. Rituximab attaches to something on a cell surface called CD20. It's on B lymphocytes, so it's for B-cell lymphomas primarily, and it makes the cell die. So they can be used in multiple ways. In the T-cell world, we're still looking for our rituximab. Perhaps we found it, but at the moment we don't have a drug that works exactly the same way. So this is what it looks like. This is CD20. You can call it a brown pathology. The stains are always brown. So the pathologist has to know which antibody this is, and it's labeled on the slide. So this happens to be CD20. So what you see is these are all the cells, and around their surface, which is where they're called antigens, where they live, all the staining is clumping because it's attaching to the CD20 on the surface of the cell, and it's creating this brown stain. So that when the pathologist looks at this, they know that all of these cells, they all mostly have CD20 on their surface, and that tells the pathologist that more likely than not it's a B lymphocyte. And then they'll do other tests to kind of hone down on what it is. And there's markers for T cells too, the same way for natural killer cells, for all these cells. So in the lymphoma world, we have a classification of lymphomas that's given to us by the World Health Organization. They just met, they just redid the classification. And you know how there's lumpers and splitters? These guys are splitters. So there's over 80 different kinds of lymphoma now. And every time they meet, they refine the list. So they take some, they have some that they call provisional, where they're kind of thinking maybe they're separate lymphomas, but they can't make up their mind. When they meet again, they decide, are we going to keep it provisional? Have we decided it's not really a unique thing? We're going to take it off the list. They refine the diagnoses that have already been set because there's new knowledge. And so they continually refine these lists. But it's a little daunting, even for general oncologists to look at because there's so many. And each lymphoma that they've noted on the list is different in some way. Either it's different the way the person finds out they have lymphoma, it's different in the way it stains, it's different genetically, it has a unique treatment, there's something that sets it apart from everything else. So in the world of cutaneous or skin B-cell lymphomas, these are the ones that we currently have. So there's slow-growing ones and faster-growing ones. The slower-growing ones are the more common. One's called primary cutaneous follicle center lymphoma. It's a kind of a confusing name because there's a follicular lymphoma, and that's different. That's a nodal-based lymphoma. There's also primary cutaneous marginal zone lymphoma. Marginal zone lymphoma is a general big classification, and it shows up in people in several different ways. This is the skin version. And then on the more aggressive side of things, we have something called primary cutaneous diffuse large B-cell lymphoma leg type. I know that's weird, but it was first described on people's legs. It doesn't have to be on somebody's leg, but it got that name and it stuck. And then there's another kind of diffuse large B-cell lymphoma that can sometimes be in the skin. It's called intravascular, meaning the cells are in the blood vessels. So this is kind of what we have to work with at this moment. Slow-growing cutaneous B-cell lymphomas, they're in the dermis, so they have some thickness to them. So it's not just what the pathologist sees, but it relates to how you see it on the person. So if the cells are deep in the skin, then what the person can see or what their doctor can see is kind of a very thick area, sometimes with the cells kind of creating like a heaped up area that's red and kind of smooth on top. They tend to be in younger people. People that have slow-growing cutaneous B-cell lymphomas do great, but what they can look at is that the skin lesions will often recur in the skin. The lymphoma doesn't often, only about 10% go into lymph nodes. So it's characterized by this kind of slow thing where people have skin lesions and then they may go away or be taken away by a medicine or by surgery or by radiation, and then some other one pops up. Meanwhile, the person's living their life and they're doing very well. Cutaneous T-cell lymphomas is a very big group now. So in 1979 was kind of the first time that somebody figured out that there were B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. And they didn't use monoclonal antibodies to figure that out. They used sheep red blood cells. Now I'm really dating myself. But it was the first time that somebody figured out that this thing that was called mycosis fungoides in the 1800s, because of how it looked to somebody's eye, was actually a T-cell lymphoma. So someone coined this term cutaneous T-cell lymphoma. But in 1979, the only one we knew was mycosis fungoides. But now we have a whole bunch of them. So the term is not so useful anymore because to me, if somebody says I have cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, I don't really know what they're talking about. They have to tell me exactly which one. There's a version of mycosis fungoides that's called Sézary syndrome. Sézary was the person that described it again in the 1800s. And patients with Sézary syndrome look different. They're, instead of having like a patch or a discrete rash in their normal skin, they're usually mostly red. And they have the cells in greater number floating around in the blood. In point of fact, one of these days, those are going to be separate diseases probably because they're not the same cell. But currently we still consider Sézary syndrome a subtype of mycosis fungoides. So when we look at all these cutaneous T-cell lymphomas, we have the most common, which is still mycosis fungoides, and there are all kinds of variations. There's variations in how people look. There's variations on how the pathology looks. The World Health Organization has chosen to set aside a couple of variants, but there's actually a lot more. And then the other most common kind of cutaneous T-cell lymphoma are the CD30 lymphoproliferative disorder. So that's anaplastic large cell of the skin and this thing called lymphomatoid papulosis. And then you see there's some other entities, some of them provisional, some of them real entities. They're very uncommon, but they're listed both on the slow and on the fast-growing side of the cutaneous T-cell lymphoma classification. So just to talk about CD30 positive lymphoproliferative disorders just a little bit, because they are common, there's many conditions that can have this stain CD30 on them. And one of them happens to be mycosis fungoides. But these disorders, when you talk about them, people are really talking about a disorder called lymphomatoid papulosis, or primary cutaneous anaplastic large cell lymphoma. Or there's an anaplastic large cell lymphoma that involves lymph nodes, and sometimes can involve skin. Those are the kind of the big spread of these disorders, going all the way from lymphomatoid papulosis, which isn't really a lymphoma, but kind of got stuck in this classification because of the company it keeps. It's a disorder where people get skin lesions that are under the quarter size, and they come and they go, they come and they go, and that's just what they do. Come and they go. We don't know why they come, we don't know why they go, but that's what they do. All the way to systemic anaplastic large cell lymphoma, which is a nodal-based lymphoma that's extremely aggressive. So there's a lot of differences between all these different kinds of conditions. So it's a spectrum. And as I mentioned, they can all look exactly the same under a microscope. So it is extremely important that the doctor that's treating the patient understands that the pathologist can't really tell them what it is. They have to look at the patient and they have to make up their minds what they're looking at. It's very, very important. So lymphomatoid papulosis, it looks very malignant under a microscope, but in the person, it's actually sort of benign. Comes and it goes, and comes and it goes, and that's what it does. And they're always under the size of a quarter. It may take them about 6 weeks to go away. Sometimes in some patients they leave a little scar. Sometimes as the lesion kind of goes through its life cycle, in the center of it, it has like a blister, or sometimes it fills with pus and people think it's an infection. They start, as you can imagine, messing with it. But it heals and kind of goes through a little cycle. They tend to be somewhat younger patients. And the reason why we continue to follow patients like this is some people actually need to get treated. They have so many lesions that it's really bothersome to them. The other reason is that like people that have lymphoma, there's an increased chance of other lymphomas. So the common ones for somebody to get with lymphomatoid papulosis, which isn't all that common, probably about max in any trials, probably about 15%, is other kinds of skin lymphomas, like mycosis fungoides, or Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is curable. So whenever we're looking at somebody that comes in, if they have a skin lesion that looks different, then we biopsy it, because likely it is different. So one person can have different kinds of skin lesions, different conditions going on in the same person. And they have to be treated, as is appropriate for that particular skin lesion. Primary cutaneous anaplastic large cell lymphoma is like a lymphomatoid papulosis lesion on steroids. It looks exactly the same, but big. And they usually come just one at a time. Sometimes they will go away by themselves too, but not always, about 30% of the time. So sometimes they have to be taken care of by radiation or by surgery or other means. And in these patients too, only the minority will ever get any disease that goes anywhere else. Probably the most common would be the lymph node that's draining where the skin lesion is. And medical literature tells us that even though that happens, that the person can still do very, very well. And then I'm going to spend most of my time on mycosis fungoides because it's the most common skin lymphoma, and I'll bet most of you here, that's kind of why you came. So mycosis fungoides, it was described by a French dermatologist, just like Sézary syndrome in the 1800s. He described a patient that had tumors, and to him it looked like mushrooms. So he didn't know what it was. He just described it. That's all he could do. And the name kind of stuck, even though it's very misleading. So if somebody looks up mycosis in the Merck manual or Googles it, they'll see that it means fungus. Like when you get athlete's foot, but it's not anything related to fungus. It just has that crazy name still. And as I said, mycosis fungoides sets itself aside from the other skin lymphomas because it likes to be in the very superficial layer. And so when you're looking at people's skin lesions, often they're kind of scaly. And because the epidermis, when the cells die, they die and it looks like scale. So it's often something that looks fairly superficial. Sézary syndrome, as I mentioned, another French dermatologist a little bit later, was also described where people are generally red and have scaly skin, and they are bothered by changes in their nails, sometimes little slits in the skin of their palms or soles, sometimes leg swelling, sometimes changes in their eyelids. Their eyelids get kind of distorted by the skin disorder. And as I mentioned, there are lots of different kinds, and that's why it makes it kind of interesting as a physician to try and figure out if somebody has mycosis fungoides. So there's people with darker skin where their mycosis fungoides shows up as light areas. That's it. It doesn't have any scaling really. It's just that some of the pigment is gone in the skin. There are people that just get one lesion, usually on an extremity, and has two people's names attached to it. Warrior call-up. There's a follicular mycosis fungoides where the cells, instead of staying in that epidermis, they've decided they like to kind of be in conjunction with the person's hair, and so they travel along down in the hair shaft, and sometimes they make the hair fall out because the hair is like you pot a plant in cement, right? The hair doesn't want to live like that. There's granulomatous mycosis fungoides. Granuloma is a kind of an immune system reaction. There's mycosis fungoides that look like blisters, all different kinds. So it's really a challenge sometimes to make a diagnosis. And I know that many patients here probably have been frustrated by going to a lot of different doctors and they didn't know what it was and they got a lot of different biopsies. And that's kind of why, because it can look really different. The person really has to be thinking about it. They have to get the biopsy in optimal conditions. So there's ways to get biopsies that will help you and ways that aren't so helpful. And then they have to send it to the right pathologist. Because sometimes the pathologist hasn't seen very much mycosis fungoides either. And they don't really recognize what the changes are. So it's a little bit of a challenge. So this is what a skin biopsy looks like for somebody that has mycosis fungoides. So you have all this blue here, that's all the infiltrating cells that don't belong in the dermis. And then they want to go up here, and they form something called a Patriae's microabscess. And that's what this is. So these are all these cells that have kind of made the journey from the dermis up into the epidermis. And why are they all here? It's because there's a cell called a Langerhans cell, and it's actually feeding them. So they're kind of coming up to this cell on purpose because it sustains them. So they have this this tropism, this like to go into the epidermis because there's a reason, because they're getting nourishment up there. So Patriae's microabscesses are something that a pathologist really looks for because it's something that's really characteristic of mycosis fungoides and not of other things. And then, just so you see that there are an equal number of monoclonal antibodies for looking at T cells, this is a stain for CD3. CD3 marks T cells. You can see here are all these same cells in the dermis, going up to the epidermis, that all have CD3 on their surface because they're T cells, they're T lymphocytes. And that's how the pathologist starts to characterize what kind of infiltration of cells there are. So, I'll stop here if anybody has any questions because I'm going to talk about staging just real briefly. Does anybody have any questions? You're good? All right. Okay. So you have to, when you're looking at staging for skin lymphomas, do not look at the one for the nodal lymphomas or you're going to get upset. Because nodal lymphomas have a specific staging system. It's called the Ann Arbor staging system. It was created when a bunch of people met in Ann Arbor, and it doesn't relate to skin lymphomas at all. So a different staging system was initiated primarily for mycosis fungoides. And before we kind of talk about staging, it's more important probably to talk about why do we even have stages? What does it do for you? So mostly why we do it is because it tells the physician what kind of treatment they should offer. It might give the patient and the physician, in a very, very general sense, what to expect. But we have to realize that when you see survival curves, and there aren't any really good ones for mycosis fungoides anyway, but if you see them online, you have to realize it's a statistic. It doesn't mean anything to the person themselves. It just tells you if you have 100 people in the room and you come back in 5 years, how many of them will still be there, but it doesn't tell you who they're going to be. So it's sort of meaningless in a way because each person is their own statistic. It also tells a physician where to look when they're trying to assess how the treatment is working. Are we doing a good job? Well, I have to know where the disease was to begin with to know where to look. And when we're doing clinical trials, it's really important because when we do clinical trials, we have to compare apples to apples. So I have to, when we're doing a clinical trial, they have to designate what group of patients are we interested in this treatment for. And then when we're talking about different trials, we can't compare results for patients that have early stage disease to results for people that have later stage disease. It's not fair. So it's used in a very important way when we're doing studies or clinical trials. And as I said, it doesn't tell us how an individual is going to do. And in mycosis fungoides, the stages were quite arbitrary. So a bunch of people were in a room. They, at the time, were using something called a TNM staging system. T stands for tumor, N stands for node, M stands for metastasis, which is not a very good word for a blood cancer because we don't have metastasis. Their blood cells that go anywhere they want. But they still use that system. And they tried to fit this new staging system that was occurring for mycosis fungoides into that. And so when it came to the tumor part of it, it basically got down to a bunch of people deciding, okay, we think it makes a difference if you have different thicknesses of skin lesions or different amounts of skin lesions in your body. We're going to go with that. And really, quite arbitrarily, to set up a staging system, it happens to work, but it was quite arbitrary. So, as I mentioned, these T cells, they move around. They go in this, they spend a little time in the skin, spend a little time in the blood, they take a turn through the lymph node, they take a little turn in the lymphatic fluid, they go like a circuit. So when we're staging patients, we want to look at all those areas somehow to kind of ascertain if we think that they're involved or not. So we want to look at the skin for sure, because that's the main thing that brought the person to us most likely. We want to have some assessment of their lymph nodes, whether they're enlarged or not. We want to have some assessment of the blood. Do we think there's very minimal cells in the blood or a lot? And then we assess other organs, primarily by examination. But because these are blood cells and they can be anywhere they want, we want to assess other areas where we think they may lodge. So how do we assess the skin? A lot of people do photography. Probably many of you have had your doctors take pictures to document the kind of condition that you have on your skin. The physician makes a note about what kind of skin lesions they see and what the distribution is, sometimes how much of the body's surface area is involved. When it comes to evaluating lymph nodes, primarily we do that based on examination because mycosis fungoides most often involves lymph nodes that you can feel rather than the ones inside of us that you can't feel. So most often we're evaluating by exam. In some patients, they might have CT scans or PET scans. In the blood, we can do blood tests. So we can do a CBC, which is a complete blood count. We can do other tests to look at liver function. We can do a test called LDH. It's lactate dehydrogenase, not related to your cholesterol. It's a tumor marker, it's an enzyme. Sometimes we do testing for viruses that we know can mimic conditions like mycosis fungoides. And we can do something called flow cytometry, which is a way of characterizing clones of cells in the blood that are abnormal. So they take a tube of blood, they run it through a special machine that, again, uses monoclonal antibodies to kind of tag cells and see if there's any that show up that are identical to one another, which is what a lymphoma is, a clone of cells. Looking at other organs, primarily we evaluate that by physical examinations and blood tests. Occasionally some patient might have imaging. I'll go through the imaging in case somebody's ever had it, just to understand what did you do. So we use PET scans now, and we use CT scans, and they show different things. A PET scan, does anybody have a PET scan in here? Okay. So you know when you have a PET scan, they inject something into you, right? And they come in, and the thing they're injecting is like in a lead box. What it is sugar that's been labeled by something that will emit a particle that will make a picture if a camera scans over your body. So they're injecting sugar, and every cell in our body uses sugar as a form of energy, some cells more than others. So we would hope if we inject sugar, our brains would light up. That's why the brain is actually cut out of the picture, because all of our brains are, even though we don't think so, all of our brains have taken up sugar. Our heart's taken up a lot of sugar because it's a muscle, so it's using sugar to pump. As the sugar gets out of the system, you'll see it in the urine sometimes, so the bladder may light up. But other than that, everything else is sort of humming along at a low rate. So it's taking up sugar, but if you set the gain right on the machine, you don't see every single thing in the body light up. So what you do see light up, other than normal structures, are things like tumors, or even sometimes inflammation, because a tumor needs that sugar to make more cells. So it's sucking up a lot of sugar. If you have pneumonia, it's also going to light up with a PET scan because there's a lot of cells in that area trying to fix the problem. And they're metabolizing sugar too because they're trying to do a job. So people look at these things. They're not particularly beautiful pictures. I'll show you what it looks like, kind of like blobs. And they use CT scanning, which is more of an X-ray kind of test, to show what the structure is that's lighting up on the PET scan. So CT scans, what they are is a very fancy way of using X-rays to image inside someone's body. It's as if you took my body and you cut it across and then you turned it on end. So you can see all the structures inside very beautifully. But sometimes you can't tell what the significance of them are. So these two tests are very complementary. So as an example, here's somebody's PET scan. You can see their brain lit up. You can see their bladder lights up. This is a normal one. You can see their heart's kind of lighting up. This is somebody who actually has lymphoma in their lymph nodes. So again, you see their bladder, their brain, their heart, but you also see all this other stuff. And all this other stuff is their lymph nodes that have lymphoma in it. This is before treatment, oops, and this is after. So you can see that the lymphoma is gone, those lymph nodes no longer show up. But you see, it's not a very nice picture, right? It's sort of amorphous. So, oops, oh, my CAT scan disappeared. I'm sorry, but the CAT scan would look more like, this is not the greatest, but it would look more like this, but better. And it would be taken the other way. It will show the structures. So when they put the two tests together, they can look at this, say, and they can actually see what structures are taking up on PET, and they can measure them for you, and can do all kinds of things. All right, so I told you there was a T and M staging, and then later on, a B part of it was added on for blood involvement. And so the T, the tumor part, has totally to do with whoever's doing the staging, their eye. It's in the eye of the beholder because in groups, 20 years ago, we sat in a group, all doctors that do mycosis fungoides all the time. We passed around a board that had Play-Doh on it, mimicking skin lesions, and asked everybody to say what kind of skin lesion this was. And not one person agreed with another person. So it's very subjective. And so when we're doing trials, it's very important that the same person evaluate the person on the trial each time, because my eye doesn't see it the way somebody else's eye sees it. So T1 and T2 are things called patches or plaques. Patches are things that you could see with your eye on somebody's skin, but if you closed your eyes, you may not be able to tell that they're there because there's not so much thickness. Plaques, there's thickness. So you can both see it with your eye and feel it with your fingers. T1 means that there's less than 10% of the body's skin surface area, and T2 means there's greater than 10%. What is 10%? It turns out your palm is 1% surface area. So when somebody's figuring out how much surface area is involved, they're basically imagining, or even using, sometimes in some studies we actually use a tracing of a person's palm. They're using that and they're kind of imagining how many palms worth of skin lesions are there. That's what they're doing. T3 is tumors. What is a tumor? You know, it's kind of hard to describe it. My tumor might not be the same as somebody else's tumor, but they're generally very much raised like a dome areas. And T4 are people that are all red, and that's called erythroderma. Now the node part of the staging, it has to do with what the pathologist sees. So if there has been no node biopsy, nobody can tell if somebody has a big lymph node, if it's involved or it's not. Because think about what lymph nodes are really supposed to do. What they're really doing is they have a territory that they're responsible for patrolling, for taking care of. It's part of our immune system. So if we get a strep throat, the lymph nodes in our neck, they're responsible for the throat. They enlarge as the cells are created to fight whatever is causing the strep throat, the strep. They have more and more cells. They're living in the lymph node enlarges. When the threat is gone, when the strep throat is gone, those cells have a natural death. It's called apoptosis. And they die. And the lymph node shrinks back down again. So if someone has a skin disorder, there's going to be some lymph nodes that might be enlarged just because they're attempting to do their job. For instance, if somebody has a lesion on their leg, the lymph nodes responsible for the leg are in our groin. So you might see that somebody has enlarged groin lymph nodes because they're trying to fight the skin lesion on the leg, be it mycosis fungoides, be it a cut, anything. So if we don't take a biopsy of that lymph node, we can't really know why it's enlarged. And a lot of times they're enlarged just because they're doing their job. That's called dermatopathic when they do that. So to actually count them as involved with mycosis fungoides is pretty obvious to a pathologist. It has to have cells that are taking over the whole architecture of the lymph node that are malignant cells, and it's quite easy to see. It's not that they have to do special tests to bring them out. It's obvious. Otherwise, it's not of much importance to the person. And then the M, which is in a solid tumor, something that's in an organ, we call metastasis. Here it just relates to whether somebody has organ involvement or not, which happens to be very uncommon in mycosis fungoides. And then there's a blood scale depending on how many cells, malignant cells, are in the blood. So B2 is what patients have when they have Sézary syndrome, and there's a certain number of cells. And you usually find that out by flow cytometry. So this is just how people figure out body surface area. It's based on burns. So when you hear somebody has burns over 80% of their body or whatnot, they're basing it off of these kinds of diagrams that basically people have figured out what percent of the skin is in each area. And then you kind of look. So if I'm doing a clinical trial and I have to figure out body surface area, I might look at somebody's forearm and kind of eyeball what percent of their skin on their forearm do I think is involved. I might even use the person's palm or my palm to figure it out as a kind of a gauge. So it turns out that stage 1, mycosis fungoides, is people with patches or plaques. 1A is less than 10% of the body surface area, and 1B is greater than 10%. Stage 2B is somebody that has tumors. Stage 3 is somebody that has erythroderma that's all red. 3A is somebody that has erythroderma but not cells in the blood. 3B is a little bit of cells in the blood. 4A1 is a lot of cells in the blood. That's for people that truly have Sézary syndrome. That's their stage. And 4A2 is somebody that really has involvement in their lymph node, and 4B is somebody that has involvement of an organ. So that's kind of how the staging system works. And it sort of works. What people are realizing is that 2B maybe has the same prognosis as a higher stage. That's the only thing that people have noticed where this falls apart. As I said, when people designed it, it was very arbitrary, so they didn't really know that it would work. It does sort of work, but there's some kind of fine points to it. In other skin lymphomas, when we stage, we do a staging that's more like what we would do for nodal lymphomas. We pay a lot of attention to if the person has what's called B symptoms, that is fever for no good reason, drenching night sweats, and I mean drenching, not like a little bit, like you would have to get up at night and take a shower, change your clothes, that kind of thing. Very profound. And profound weight loss, not a couple of pounds, but like 20 pounds for no good reason. We do the exam, we do very similar blood tests. Almost on most patients with other skin lymphomas, mycosis fungoides, they really are getting scans. They may have other kinds of tests as well, depending on what is found. And then there's a staging system that, to be honest, nobody uses. So it exists, but it's very complicated. So what you do with these stages after you acquire them is to figure out how to treat people. So I took out the slide that everybody always shows. It's sitting in the deck somewhere, but basically when somebody has early stage mycosis fungoides, primarily how they're treated is by something called skin-directed therapy. That is, since most of the cells are in the skin, we don't start by giving something to somebody that goes all through their body. We're going to focus on something that's focused on their skin, like light therapy, like putting a cream on, or putting chemotherapy in an ointment, or something like that. As the condition advances, then we're going to want to focus more on treating the person's whole body. So they might take a pill, or they might have something injected, but something that will go through the bloodstream and treat everything at once. And that's kind of how people use staging for the purposes of figuring out treatment.
You don't necessarily progress from one stage
Well,
to
thank you
another.
so much. No, you don't. Thank you so much for asking. So, like I said, it's not like breast cancer where somebody actually kind of thought out the staging system and sort of makes sense. This one was arbitrary, and it turns out that people don't much go from one stage to the other. So as I mentioned, people with Sézary syndrome, that's kind of how they find out that they have a problem. They always look like that, and it probably is a different condition. People that have very low stage mycosis fungoides, the majority of them will never have anything higher stage than that. And so people's conditions, they tend to run true for them. That when you see somebody for the first time, when I see somebody for the first time, I can kind of tell how it's going to go based on what their skin looks like. And so that's a very good point, because people ask it all the time. I'm stage 1 now, when am I going to be stage 4? The answer is probably never. Mm-hmm.
Do you go from stage 2 to stage, like you could stay, but does it fluctuate where you can go a little bit more and a little bit less, you jump between stages? Or you usually or is it usually that you're kind of, once you get to that stage, it's whether it's showing a lot, but you really are always at that stage?
Right. So stages, it's a convention in oncology. A stage is only when you initially diagnose someone. And you do it for the purposes of prognosis and kind of planning treatment. So as let's say you're following somebody over 10 years, it's more the second kind of situation that you described. Let's say they had skin lesions, they were stage 1A. Then they got some treatment, they don't have any skin lesions. Then one skin lesion pops up. Then maybe many skin lesions. They're always really were stage 1A, because that's how they were diagnosed. And then you kind of make a description about where it returns. So we don't keep kind of altering the stage every time somebody kind of comes back with something. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm.
What different kinds of doctors are the ones who typically are the primary treaters?
That's a good question too. So there's always these debates all the time on, there's still a listserv, probably on the Facebook page, I don't look at it, but basically you need to get somebody that knows these conditions. And it really doesn't matter who they are. So a lot of people traditionally who were doing much of the early research were dermatologists. But more often, I'm an oncologist. More often it might be some oncologists, because we treat lymphoma. And what I would say about those two groups of people is that when somebody specializes in this area, they don't have blinders on. I know a lot more dermatology than most internal medicine people. And in fact, I got an appointment in dermatology without doing the training. And a similar thing happens for my dermatology colleagues. They're not oncologists like I am. They didn't do a fellowship, but they know a lot more oncology than a regular dermatologist does. So I would say the label of who they are isn't so important, but what is important is that they have some familiarity, with this condition so they know how to treat. If they don't, then they just need to buddy up with somebody that does to advise them. So a lot of people can't travel to a place where there's a center of excellence and they're being treated by their local dermatologist or their local oncologist, and that's fine too. But then it's important to use the resources that are available, because there are people all over the country who have spent their whole careers basically researching and treating patients with skin lymphomas. Mm-hmm.
For the various blood tests we mentioned, staging, is that something that's done only then, or should it be done on a regular basis?
Usually I only do it the first time. If there's an abnormality that I want to follow in somebody that I detected, then I might do it repeatedly. But for most patients with early stage mycosis fungoides, which is going to be the majority of people, I never repeat the blood test again. Unless there's something about what they're telling me, or something about their examination that makes me suspicious that something's different.
So there's no blood work that you do on a routine?
Right, I don't. That the yield is too low. Oh, guys. I know it's a lot. All right. Oh, good.
What do
Okay.
you tell a family member who might worry when they hear you have lymphoma?
Are they worried about you or themselves?
Or
both.
Even better. Well, let's do both.
Well, I guess I would try and educate them. There's lots of different lymphomas, right? Some of them, we treat very aggressive lymphomas. We treat with a bunch of chemotherapy if we're trying to cure. We also treat people with very slow growing lymphomas, and sometimes we don't treat them at all. So there's a huge splay. So I guess I would try and be more specific, which is why we're trying to be specific here in the different disorders, because they're all different. And you want the knowledge so that you can explain it to somebody. I would try and explain it to them. I would offer to show them literature, or there's so many different places people can go. I think an equal amount of time, or maybe perhaps more, people are worried about themselves as your family member. What does this mean for them? So it turns out that in the lymphoma world, there aren't very many families where there's too many lymphomas, maybe about 10%. And we don't even know why that is. It's just an observation that's been made. So most of the time we can reassure family members that this has nothing to do with them. It's just a unique event that happened to the person. And most of the time, I have to say, we don't know why it happened to the person either. We know that there's some things that cause lymphomas to form in people, mostly related to affecting the immune system. So when the immune system doesn't work, or works in a strange way, people get more lymphomas of all kinds. So if you kind of think about how does that happen? Well, somebody could be born with an immune system that doesn't function. Sadly, as we all age, our immune systems age with us and they don't work so well. You could acquire an immune problem by getting a virus like HIV or hepatitis. You could acquire an immune problem by somebody giving you a medication, like let's say somebody gets cyclosporin because they had an organ transplant. They're creating a defective immune system on purpose to keep the organ there. Some people have what's in a general term an autoimmune disorder, so the immune system gets crazy and kind of fights the person itself, like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. Those patients have a higher incidence of lymphoma too, even psoriasis, which is kind of sort of an autoimmune kind of thing. So we know a lot of different things about why people get lymphomas, but even that only explains probably 10 or 15% of all the people, and all the rest of the people we have no clue. And I should say, because somebody will probably ask about exposures in lymphomas, the only one that's clearly documented is Agent Orange that was used during the war in Vietnam. that it causes lymphomas. But some of these other things that we all wonder about, they haven't really been documented. Herbicides, dark hair dye before 1983 was documented in one study. But a lot of these things, because those studies are so hard to do, to prove, we don't really know about exposure so much. Okay, so I'm here and then there.
Difference between a plaque and a tumor in the skin?
What's the difference?
Right.
Kind of the thickness of it. So a plaque, usually, a thick plaque, the thickest they will get is maybe 4 or 5 millimeters, 4 millimeters thick. But a tumor can be like this. So it's just kind of an order of magnitude in a way. And then,
Is cutaneous T-cell lymphoma considered to be an autoimmune disease?
no, it's not. It's all lymphomas are conditions of immune cells. Lymphocytes are part of our immune system. But it's not, an autoimmune disease means that your immune system turns against you. So as an example, all right, I'll take Sjogren's syndrome because it's kind of graphic. Sjogren's syndrome, the immune system goes against glands. So it'll make somebody's mouth dry because it goes after their parotid gland, or their eyes dry because it goes after the lacrimal gland. So it's really the body turning on itself. And that's not the case here. These cells aren't turning on anything. They're just accumulating in a place they don't belong. And they accumulate there because they like to be there, number one, and because in lymphoma, all these, and kind of in all cancers, but lymphoma particularly, all of our cells have a built-in expiration date, like our appliances. And sometimes they get crazy and they forget that they're supposed to go. And the pathway that tells them to go is called the apoptotic pathway. So there's things in the body that are supposed to tell the cells, time for you to leave. So in lymphoma, those cells forget. They're clones, they keep churning out identical members, and then they forget to die. So they accumulate because they like that area, and because they're making more and more of themselves, and then they don't die. But they're not really destroying anything, necessarily. They just sort of hanging out.
Phil Mickelson is a famous golfer who has an autoimmune disease, I believe, and they treat him with Humira. So would Humira not be appropriate then for cutaneous T-cell lymphoma?
That's correct. It's a good example. So Humira alters the immune system. So I'm sure you've seen all those commercials where the guy talks really fast, and at the bottom they say they cause lymphoma. So it's drugs like Humira that people are very concerned promote the formation of lymphomas by creating an immune deficiency. So you're right, if somebody has a lymphoma, we try very hard, even though they may want to get treated with these drugs for some other condition, not to use those drugs, because we will likely make the lymphoma worse.
Hi, is the ANA positive finding of any connection with autoimmune disorder?
You use ANA as a screen for autoimmune disorders, but some people just walk around with positive ANAs and they don't have an autoimmune disorder. It's just sort of a laboratory finding for them. So you, again, have to put it into the context of what is the patient experiencing to know if it has any significance for that patient. So sometimes where it comes up is, it turns out if somebody has lupus and you put them into a light box, they'll burn it. So a lot of dermatologists will screen everybody with ANAs before they go into a light box. So sadly, sometimes the person finds out their ANA isn't exactly normal, and then it creates a whole, kind of concern about what does that mean. Most of the time, if you weren't doing the ANA because you thought somebody had lupus, it means nothing. The lupus is a very specific disorder that has specific complaints and specific laboratory abnormalities. It's not so subtle. ANA, anti-nuclear antibody. So it's a blood test that's done as a screener for autoimmune disorders. So what it's showing is that the body's putting antibodies against some portion of their own cells, right? So it's doing what it shouldn't do. It's not supposed to turn against you. It's supposed to be utilized to fend off invaders. Oh, good. All right, we're going that way, then we'll work our way back.
Are tumors associated, do you find tumors in the early stages of MF?
Well, it's a catch-22. If you had tumors, you wouldn't have early stage MF. So the question is, I guess I'll turn it around a little bit. Can people with patches and plaques have a tumor? Yes. The answer is yes. So sometimes people will just have one tumor, and you could just radiate it and get it out of the picture, and it won't happen again. Unfortunately for other people, their disease may be such that they make many tumors, and then, as you can imagine, if it's this thick, shining a light on it isn't going to do much. So then the person has to get treated with something, at least as part of their treatment, something that's going to go through the bloodstream and bathe that tumor by bathing the blood that feeds to it. Because if I just shine a light on it, it's not going to get to the bottom. So it kind of changes, you have to think again about how you're going to treat that person and whether your treatment will be adequate if you just are treating their patches with plaques.
Well, would a combination of, say, radiation and UVA, would that be
You could. So if somebody had like one or two tumors, you could ask the radiation therapist to get rid of those tumors, you don't have to deal with it, and treat the rest of the person's manifestations of mycosis fungoides with light. Where it gets to be a problem is if the person has multiple tumors, or if after radiating those tumors they just pop up with some more, you can't, it's like whack-a-mole kind of, you can't keep radiating each tumor because as soon as you finish one will show up somewhere else. So then you have to start thinking, well, you know what, this is probably not really the way I should be approaching this. Really, I need to give the person something systemic so it just won't make any more tumors. And the ones that are there will go away. So it's kind of a judgment call when you decide that the person's disease has crossed that line from being basically patches and plaques with one tumor to, no, the tumors are really the big issue that needs to be dealt with.
So what stage would you call it?
At the time that somebody has tumors, if somebody shows up and they have tumors, that they're too big. Yeah, you go by that thing. You go by the worst skin manifestation that you see. That determines the stage.
And you said something systemic, given to i.e.
Anything that's going to go through the bloodstream. So it could be something, no, not chemo. We actually don't use chemo very much, a little tiny bit. It could be a pill that you take, and then it goes to your stomach absorbs it, the medicine goes to your bloodstream. That means your heart's going to pump it every single place that gets blood, which is basically everywhere except for your cornea, and maybe your brain. Because there's something called a blood-brain barrier. Our brains are so important, it's kind of blocked off from the rest of our body. But if you take something orally, or if you inject something, it goes into the bloodstream. Then everything gets treated by it.
And what is that pill or that bloodstream?
Oh, there's a whole long list. I don't know if you can you pull up a hidden slide or no?
Can we go to the slide?
Yeah. If you go to my talk, the next slide, if you could just unlight it. I'll give you, there's a lot of them. So, it goes all the way from, okay, pills. We have something called retinoids. They're like vitamin A. That does not mean you go out and take vitamin A because it will make you sick. But let's see if we can find the slide. So there's things called retinoids. There's things, pills, HDAC inhibitors. They're not chemotherapy. They work via a certain, HDAC inhibitors actually modify the DNA of the cell, how it's expressed. Not its structure, but how it's expressed. There are some chemotherapy pills that are very gentle. Injecting-wise, I don't know if you see this, then we'll show you. Injecting-wise, oh gosh, people have been so creative. There's HDAC inhibitors. There's a drug that's currently off the market, but I'll show you it's being resurrected again. It's a diphtheria toxin that's attached to an antibody. There's, I'm blocking on this. There's a monoclonal antibody that's used. There's extracorporeal photophoresis, which is kind of light for your lymphocytes. There's a whole bunch of different things.
I like
And
how
so-
you say this all with a smile. We can tell you really love what you do.
I do. I've done it for a long time, so I gotta like it. But there's a lot of different things, and so basically, you know when you're trying to figure out a treatment for someone, you know the characteristics of that treatment. How fast does it work? Who does it work the best for? What are the side effects, and kind of what is that person looking for? What other conditions does the person have? And you kind of go through all the choices, either with the person or in your head, or both, and you figure out at that moment in time what's the best thing to use. If the person doesn't tolerate it or it doesn't work, then you sit down and you do it again with the stuff that you have left. Same kind of thing. At this moment in time, what makes the most sense for this particular person? So there's lots of different choices, and there's not a right answer. And that's kind of the art of this, right? Is that you can't really tell somebody, okay, after somebody has light therapy, and that doesn't work for them anymore, or they can't have it, then you go to this, then you do this thing. It doesn't work like that because there's so many different options, and people are individuals.
What's on the slide?
That algorithm thing.
Oh, okay.
You know, this slide is ubiquitous in every talk that anybody ever gives. There we go. And it changes a little bit over the years. There you go. All right, so these are some of the choices, and we actually now have a new one. So I'm going to have to fix this. And this has been, altered through the years as we get more and more things. But basically what you see is when somebody has early stage mycosis fungoides, you're basically doing things to the skin. You're shining light on it, or putting steroids on it, or putting chemotherapy in an ointment. And as people maybe go through those things and don't find them useful for themselves, or have more advanced conditions, there's other choices. So the first thing is HDAC inhibitors. Then ECP is extracorporeal photopheresis. Sometimes people have radiation. Ixaritine is the retinoid. It's really a rexinoid. Then we have chemotherapies like methotrexate or pralatrexate. Denileukin diptotox is the thing that's off the market but is being resurrected. We have alemtuzumab that's an antibody. Sometimes people get bone marrow transplants. The newer thing that will probably get an FDA indication is this thing called brentuximab vedotin. It's an antibody against CD30, and it has a chemotherapy attached to it. And you inject it into people. The drug goes to the cell with the CD30. The cell eats it up, and then the chemotherapy detaches and kills the cell. It's kind of a fancy way of giving kind of a weak chemotherapy. And it's currently on the market for Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is CD30 positive, and for anaplastic large cell lymphoma of the nodes, which is CD30 positive. And a study was done in patients who have mycosis fungoides that are CD30 positive. And there's been some other work done for lymphomatoid papulosis and anaplastic large cell lymphoma, and it was a good study, so probably the drug will get another indication. So we were talking before about who cares if it gets another indication. You care because then your insurance company can't deny you. So if it's very expensive for a drug company to get FDA indications. They don't do it all the time. In oncology, they don't do it a lot. So sometimes we have to fight with insurance companies to get a drug for a person that may be appropriate for them, but hasn't been designated by the Food and Drug Administration as a drug that you use to treat that condition. So when a company goes to get an FDA indication, when we go to the insurance company and we say we want to use brentuximab vedotin for cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, we kind of can't say no because the FDA has already agreed that that drug is appropriate for that group of patients based on data.
I just started on it about a month ago. Insurance is paying for it. So far, pretty positive signs.
Yeah, so that's kind of our new, it's an older, not that old a drug, it's been on the market maybe 5 years, but it's being repurposed, if you will. And then another, an antibody, so I've said we've been looking for our good antibody for T-cell lymphoma. An antibody will be going to the Food and Drug Administration for a possible approval for mycosis fungoides. So we'll see if we get our antibody maybe. So there's always, the reason why I smile is because I've been doing this for over 30 years, and when I started there was really not very much you could do. But now there's all these things. And that's because people are continually doing clinical trials and research. And many of you maybe participated in clinical trials. If somebody doesn't choose to be the brave one to participate, everybody gets nothing. Right? So we have to do these trials to get these drugs. So it takes kind of pioneers, if you will, in the patient world to say, I'm going to try a trial even though I don't know if this stuff works, and maybe we don't know exactly what bad things it does. I'm going to do it. And maybe I personally will benefit, but certainly this is how we get every single drug. If we don't do trials, there are no new drugs. So, so it's been very gratifying over this very large period of time to see the ability for dermatologists and oncologists to work together, which was a big hurdle, to have people in all different countries work together, which is a big hurdle, and to have people cooperate really to do trials, because it's an unusual disorder, so it's very unlikely that one place is ever going to do their own trial. No matter how much they might tout that they did it, they didn't do it by themselves, because it's almost impossible. So we all have to work together to get these things done, and that really has come about in the last many years.
You mentioned a trial. There's been a trial in recent years, the final stage trial for Sézary. It's designated KW0761, and it's a monoclonal antibody. Could you comment on the status of that trial, and could you also comment on the effectiveness of this monoclonal antibody for Sézary in comparison with other possible treatments?
So that has a name, ogamulizumab, and actually has a real name, but I don't know what it is, because they're going to the Food and Drug Administration with their data, which was positive. It actually wasn't just in Sézary's, it was for people with mycosis fungoides and Sézary's. The striking finding was that it cleared out the blood very well in Sézary's patients, and also their skin. And for that reason, they're going to the Food and Drug Administration, I don't know when, but at some point, to try and get approval for the drug. The drug's already approved in Japan, but for a different T-cell lymphoma that they have in Japan that relates to, I know it sounds such a weird story. There's a virus that people have on a particular island in Japan, and it's passed when people are born through breast milk. So there are endemic areas of this virus, and people walk around with it for their whole lives, but about 2% of them get a T-cell lymphoma that sometimes looks like mycosis fungoides. And so they got approval for that and then other disorders in Japan. So that's the status of that drug. So there's no more trial, because now the trial is completed and the data is going to the Food and Drug Administration. I think part of the reason why people are attracted to it is because the antibody that we have is alemtuzumab. It's down here in the right lower corner. It's a drug that hits a marker on lymphocytes that kills all lymphocytes, not just T lymphocytes. There's B lymphocytes, it kills T lymphocytes. So while it's a very useful drug, it creates a very profound immune deficiency, and we don't like that. And so people don't like using it very much. So this newer drug probably doesn't do that. It has its own toxicity, which is weirdly known as skin rash, that has to be managed. But it's maybe a more satisfactory antibody, and we'll have to see what the applicability is to other T-cell lymphomas versus Sézary's. Then there's another antibody, and it's only phase 1, that's against a different target. So mogamulizumab is against something called CCR4. It's something on the cell that causes it to kind of adhere to other cells. And there's another antibody that's in phase 1 that's against something called KIR, K-I-R, and that's also looks somewhat promising, but it's only phase 1. So does everybody know how trials happen? Phase 1, 2, 3? Okay. So somebody gets an idea to use a drug. Usually, often, they get the idea by using it in a laboratory against cells. Sadly, there aren't very many cell cultures for cutaneous T-cell lymphoma, something related to sustaining the cells. So that doesn't happen so much for us. Or they may get the idea by using it in animals. Sometimes they can't even do that. In T-cell lymphoma, we can't do that because we don't have an animal model either. So they get the idea, all right, I like the idea, I like the way this works. I'll show you some examples later this afternoon of trials we're doing, but the first thing that happens is called a phase 1 trial. The purpose of a phase 1 trial, even though somebody might benefit from it, is really to find out how the drug should be administered, how it should be dosed, what kinds of side effects does it cause. So what they hope to get out of that trial at the end is if they feel like they want to go forward with the drug's development, that they know how to safely administer it to people. That's what the purpose of it is, even though somebody might benefit from it. Then, the drug goes into phase 2. Phase 2 is you think that drug is good for, let's say, mycosis fungoides. So you design a trial where all the patients have mycosis fungoides, they all have the same stage, they maybe had the same number of treatments before that, and then you're asking, you're using the dose that you got from the phase 1, and then you're asking, does this stuff work for mycosis fungoides? Once you ascertain that, unfortunately, the Food and Drug Administration has told us you will not get any drugs approved unless there's a phase 3 trial, and a phase 3 trial pits this new drug against something that's standard. So we have a couple of drugs that are FDA approved for mycosis fungoides. That's usually the standard. So in the trial that you're mentioning, mogamulizumab, the standard was Verinostat because that's FDA approved. So you have to pit it against something that you already have, and then you're asking the question, do we need this drug? Is it any better than what we have somehow? And then after that, after these phase 3 trials, they go to the Food and Drug Administration and ask for approval if the trial is positive. Sometimes there's phase 4 trials, that's after the drug is marketed. Somebody's trying to figure out something specific about the drug, maybe hone down on who it works for better, or hone down on how to give it better, or kind of just fine tune it. So that's kind of how these drugs grow through phases, and it takes about 10 years. So from the time somebody decides, like Susan and I have been hearing about the same drugs for a long time, and there's a lot of pitfalls that aren't scientific, that have to do with funding. So by the time somebody figures out, oh yeah, this would be a good thing to study, it will take 8 to 10 years for it to actually be on the market, where anybody that wants to can get the drug. It's a very long, arduous process.
My concern with the FDA approval process and this particular syndrome is that from what I've learned so far, each individual is so unique. So how can you have an approved phase 3, for new drugs?
Because when you design a trial, there's something called Eligibility Criterion. They're very specific. So it might say, and here's how they start out with how old the person could be. Usually, often kids are excluded from adult trials. They tell you that every male or female can do it. Then they'll tell you, well, the person has to have X stage disease. Then they'll tell you the person has to have had these 3 drugs before they can go on trial. They'll be more and more specific, so that when you actually study those patients, they're not so different from one another. Of course they're different individuals, but when you actually look at them as a group, they have more similarities than differences. So when that drug gets approved, and this is kind of the challenge, if you want to be a real purist, you would say, I'm only going to treat people that are exactly like the people that are in the trial with that drug, but that's not really what people do. Then people start to extrapolate and say, okay, this person, all right, they wouldn't have been eligible for this trial, but I still think the drug's good for them. And whether you get it paid for or not has to do with how general the FDA indication is. So sometimes the FDA and the companies will try and make the indication very, very general, like cutaneous T-cell lymphoma that has had one systemic therapy. So that way, even the people that may not have been eligible for that trial could still be treated. They try and make it more kind of inclusive when it actually goes to market.
Question about vaccines.
Yep,
They're like the shingles vaccine.
Yep.
Against the live virus.
yep.
Well, what's your feeling pro or con?
You're not supposed to get it. So the shingles virus very clearly has in the package insert that if somebody has had or has lymphoma, that they shouldn't receive it. Luckily, and this also has taken at least 15 or 20 years, there's a not live virus that finally has made it to the Food and Drug Administration. So hopefully then we would use that virus preferentially for people in whom we have concerns about live virus vaccines.
So is that approved? Is that up?
No, it's at the Food and Drug Administration I saw, but literally, because I was involved with some of the trials, it has been in trials for at least 15 years, but finally it made it to the Food and Drug Administration. So within this year, hopefully, they will have made a decision whether they think that's an appropriate vaccine to market. And even though the patients studied were having bone marrow transplants, probably people will just use it as the substitute for the live vaccine.
So the live vaccine is available now, people in any stage.
In theory, you're not supposed to use it.
Are there
And
any
I've
other-
seen all kinds of other recommendations. Oh, you can, it don't make sense to me, they seem really arbitrary. You can use it if the person's in remission, you can use it if the person hasn't had treatment for 6 months. But in point of fact, since I'm a lymphoma doctor and that's all I do, people with lymphoma don't have normal immune systems. And I know that because they get more lymphomas than the general population. And we know that lymphomas happen in deranged immune systems. So I think there's something subtle. It's not, oh, you're going to get a cold from the guy next to you and it's going to be a disaster, but there's something subtly wrong that allows the lymphoma to occur. And in some lymphomas, we understand it better than others. In Hodgkin's, as an example, we absolutely know that people that have been treated for Hodgkin's and they're in remission, years later have a defect and they get weird infections, and they just do. So we know it's pretty well documented for some lymphomas. So my idea is, if your immune system really isn't normal, whether you're in remission or not, I'm not putting the vaccine in. And hopefully, you know, very soon we'll have a substitute.
So is the shingles, is that the only one we're doing?
No, the other ones that are live, rubella is, you know, MMR, that's rubella in it is live. And then if you're an intrepid traveler, there's some typhoid and yellow fever. So typhoid, I think, has a live and a killed version, so you can choose. And yellow fever, I think, is just live, you just can't get it. But you can still travel, you just get your doctor to write a note that you have something that prevents you from getting the vaccine, the country still lets you in.
How about flu vaccines?
Flu vaccine is killed. So flu vaccine you can have. So it's just really, the only other live vaccine that's not used so much is oral polio vaccine is live. The other way that this issue comes up is if you have a patient that's young, that has a baby, the baby's being vaccinated, that when the baby gets vaccinated, the way they get rid of the virus is through their stool. So the person doesn't get to do diaper duty for like 6 weeks. Not that you shouldn't vaccinate the child, but the pediatrician has to be a little aware too of who's taking care of that child, and that maybe for a period of time they shouldn't have contact with you know, the parts of the baby that are going to have the virus being eliminated.
I want to go back a little to Phil Michelson question.
Yes,
Is it,
okay.
well, is it, I thought you were saying it was actually maybe more common for someone who has an autoimmune disease to also get a lymphoma?
Yes, that's true.
And there are certain,
Irrespective of how they've been treated. So even if they haven't received those drugs.
okay. But there are also some drugs that should be avoided.
There's also some drugs that are most commonly used to treat autoimmune conditions that we try to avoid if somebody has already had a diagnosis of lymphoma, because it might allow the lymphoma to grow more freely.
Can I ask you about this?
Sure. All right. Now you guys are on a roll. This is good.
Another vaccine that most doctors are recommending for seniors is pneumonia.
Yeah.
Pneumonia
Pneumonia is a
vaccine.
killed vaccine.
Pardon?
Pneumonia is killed. And in fact, the Center for Disease Control has a special column on the recommendations for immunocompromised people that no matter what their age, that they should receive both pneumonia vaccines, Prevnar and Pneumovax. So actually they're being encouraged to be vaccinated specifically. It's called Prevnar and Pneumovax. They're the ones for pneumococcus, for a particular bacteria that can cause pneumonia.
Did you say that the Rubella vaccine was one that should be avoided? And is that part of the MMR?
Yeah, it is. It's live. But adults don't really get it. It's kids that get it.
Sometimes if you have grandchildren, some of the kids don't use theirs. Children.
I haven't seen MMR. They've been telling DTaP, they've been telling people that take care of children or have younger children that the immunity that we thought we had lifetime for pertussis doesn't maybe exist. That one's killed. Yeah, that one's okay to take. Right. That one's okay to take.
What's being done to educate doctors about these vaccines that should be given to
The ones that you should get?
the ones that you shouldn't get if you have a diagnosis?
Well, it's in the package insert if somebody cares to use it.
How about, I've had a number of those shots, like, before I was diagnosed, so, and then she recently was because of, for various reasons, like travel and things.
Yeah.
How bad is it? How compromised am I because I've done that?
No, I think it's more of a theoretic concern that people are afraid that at the time that you get vaccinated, that if you don't have a good immune system, that you'd actually get sick from the weakened virus. But I've never actually seen anybody get sick. It's just, it's a theoretic concern. And I guess, like everything that we do, we weigh benefits and risks, right? Mm-hmm.
Shirley asked you a good question. Do you give your lectures to physicians, to your colleagues? Because they seem to be very unaware of what you're saying.
Yeah, it wouldn't be part of a lecture we would give, and the disconnect is that primary care physicians aren't going to lectures about mycosis fungoides unless, sometimes I've seen them in the audience if they have a patient and they're just really, very curious people. They want to understand for that one patient that they're taking care of. But the vast majority of them, their educational demands are in different areas. So they're not going to really come to a lecture about mycosis fungoides probably.
I was impressed with something that was done at Kaiser, where the chief pharmacist called me to go over all of my medications and made suggestions, because Dr. So-and-so prescribed this, and that's not good for this, and blah, blah, blah. That was very impressive.
Yes.
I wish my general physician was aware of these things.
Sometimes pharmacists can be very helpful that way, and the new software that's being used in most institutions allows everybody that looks at the record to see all of the person's problems and all of their medications. So though it's a nuisance to have this new software, it actually, I think, leads to much better communication, because in the past, right, it was a paper chart. Maybe I had my chart, Dr. X had their chart, do I have their chart? Never the charts shall communicate. But now if you have software, and even the software will communicate between institutions if they have the same software. So it corrects a little bit of that problem, but still you have to have the person that's interested in looking at all of that. Well, some of the software has it embedded in it. When there's a conflict in medications or a conflict with diagnosis, a little pop-up will come up, which is sort of annoying, but comes up, tells you that there's a problem, that you have to address it.
Thank you.